The morning light came slanting low over the wet grass, breaking against the curved glass of a parked Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. From a distance, it looked less like sunlight than a pulse, something alive inside the canopy. The air smelled of high-octane fuel, cigarette smoke, and frost. Inside the dispersal hut, the pilots of the 4th Fighter Group leaned over a blackboard that looked like it had been used to solve an equation. A white chalk circle marked the sun's projected arc from 0600 to 1000, 700 hours. The curve annotated with thin arrows and notations like 7 degrees east, glare margin 15 minutes window. Captain Don Blakeslee, barely 30, a veteran of the old Eagle Squadron, tapped the board with the edge of a ruler. "Gentlemen," he said, "the Luftwaffe's radar can't see what the sun eats." The men chuckled. Behind them, someone was polishing goggles on a handkerchief, others sharpening pencils. They were engineers in leather jackets, mathematicians with calloused hands. Blakeslee's tone was half joke, half catechism. "We fly into that window," he continued, "and Jerry's scopes at Dunkirk and Calais pick up ghosts, not thunderbolts. The radar boys call it ground clutter. We call it breakfast." A lieutenant near the stove scribbled the coordinates of Boulogne radar grid number J17, checking it against a copied intelligence brief from RAF Sector Control, Debden Command, March 9th, 1943. The RAF controllers had reported an odd pattern. Every dawn patrol returning from the Channel coast had gone undetected until visual contact. The Luftwaffe's ground stations had reported false returns caused by sunlight interference. It wasn't a new trick, but it was the first time the Americans decided to use it as doctrine. By March 1943, Debden's airfield had become a hybrid of old British stonework and American improvisation. Canvas tents rose beside Quonset huts. The muddy service road that led to the flight line carried both RAF, lorries and jeeps with painted pin-up girls. The mess hall served tea at breakfast, coffee at noon, bourbon at night. What bound them was geometry. Each morning, Flight Lieutenant James Storer from the Royal Air Force Meteorological Section would deliver a thin sheaf of papers. Sun position tables, Debden latitude 51 degree 57 N. It charted azimuth and elevation angles for every quarter hour of daylight. The pilots used it like scripture. "See this line here," Blakeslee said, drawing a vector from east to southwest. "At 0800, the sun's at 9 degrees above the horizon. That gives us a 30-minute glare pocket." Someone asked, "And if the weather turns?" "Then we pray to the gods of cumulus," Blakeslee said, grinning. "They'll hide us anyway." The laughter covered the nervous silence that always followed mission briefings. For every equation of light and distance, there was still the randomness of flak, the blind bullet, the missing friend. Outside, the engines began to cough awake. The sound was physical, like tearing metal wrapped in thunder. Ground crews moved with the rhythm of habit, pulling chocks, checking oil lines, slapping fuselage panels. The sunlight still low hit the P-47's cowling and exploded in a mirror-bright bloom. A mechanic cursed, shielding his eyes. "That's the idea," Blakeslee muttered. According to 8th Air Force Fighter Command, Brief 42 F-93, radar outposts along the French coast often reported intermittent, non-correlated reflections during early morning operations. Analysts at RAF Stanmore concluded the cause was the alignment between the sun's azimuth and the radar's scanning frequency. In plain language, the sun could blind a scope. The Americans called it the halo zone. Pilots learned to use it instinctively. They flew at altitudes that forced the radar's lobe into glare. The P-47's aluminum skin, highly polished and wide-winged, acted like a mobile mirror, diffusing the signal into noise. When the Luftwaffe radar operators adjusted gain controls to eliminate the false echo, they inadvertently erased the real aircraft too. The trick only worked for minutes at a time. But in air combat, a minute was eternity. Later that day, when the mission order came through escort, B-17 seconds to Don Blakeslee drew the briefing line with chalk across a map of northern France. "We hit the coast at 0800, he said, Angle 20 degrees into the sun. They'll never see us coming. At 7:58, the flight took off in staggered pairs. The runway shimmered white. Frost turned to vapor under exhaust heat. From the cockpit, Lieutenant Jim Goodson remembered later, it was like flying into fire. He squinted behind the curved glass, watching the orange flare of the rising sun smear across the canopy. The P-47 vibrated as its turbocharger spooled. Beneath him, the countryside rolled by in muted greys. At altitude, the formation turned east. The glare filled the horizon so completely that even the other Thunderbolts vanished into it. The only visible things were shadows sliding across instrument panels, the needles trembling. Jerry radar won't know whether we're airplanes or angels. Goodson radioed. The laughter that came back was half static, half prayer. On the other side of the channel, near Calais, a German radar operator at a Würzburg-Riese station adjusted his range dial and frowned. The scope flickered. Lines of light appeared and disappeared, echoes that looked like aircraft but dissolved into static. He wrote in his logbook, "False signals, possibly atmospheric." He didn't know that 12,000 feet above, 24 Thunderbolts were crossing his grid, invisible in the sun's geometry. By noon, the returning pilots landed at Debden with blackened faces, exhaust soot under their goggles. 2 aircraft were missing flak, most likely, but the mission had gone clean. The B-17 seconds reached Rouen, unmolested. In the debriefing tent, Blakeslee removed his gloves and stared at the chalkboard again. The white arc of the sun's path was still there, drawn like an equation solved by risk. He circled the time 7:55:8:10, wrote beside it, "Glare optimal. Repeat." The intelligence officer from RAF Sector Control leaned in. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that sunlight itself confused German radar?" Blakeslee shrugged. "Call it physics, call it luck. All I know is they didn't see us. When dusk fell, the airfield quieted into mist. Mechanics drained oil, pilots wrote letters. From the far edge of the tarmac, the sun dropped behind hangar roofs, casting the field in red. Someone chalked a small line on the briefing board under tomorrow's date, sunrise 6:14. The geometry would start again. In the end, the tactic wasn't written into any official manual. It lived instead in the memory of men who learned that light itself could be a weapon, that every flight was an equation between visibility and survival. Years later, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey would mention it only briefly, calling it angular exploitation of solar glare to minimize radar detection. But to the men at Debden, March 1943, it was simpler than that. They had learned to fight by the sun. By early April 1943, the 4th Fighter Group had begun to treat sunlight not merely as a navigational curiosity, but as a weapon. Intelligence reports from RAF Sector Control indicated a curious pattern along the northern French coast. Radar echoes along the Dunkirk-Calais axis had been behaving erratically during dawn and late afternoon sorties. German operators logged ghost contacts on Würzburg-Riese radars, frequently mistaking sun reflections off cloud layers for enemy aircraft. Captain Don Blakeslee had a new briefing board drawn in the same meticulous manner as March. This one extended over the channel, marking coastal radar stations with handwritten notations. J 1485, J 1687, J 18812. Each coordinate represented a window where glare would maximize radar confusion. "The physics are simple," Blakeslee told his flight leaders. "Sun, angle, metal multiply by a few dozen Thunderbolts, and Jerry sees ghosts." The men nodded, half in amusement, half in respect for the unseen mathematics. On the morning of April 4th, a formation of 24 P-47 seconds prepared for an escort mission over Rouen. The dawn sky was clear, the sunlight slanting across the airfield like liquid gold. The 339th Fighter Squadron history records this sortie as one of the first to deliberately synchronize their ingress to the solar glare window. Lieutenant Jim Goodson, flying wingman to Blakeslee, adjusted his flight path to maintain the sun just off his canopy. Through the polished aluminum, he could see only the bright reflection, the horizon rendered a washed-out white. It was disorienting but intentional. "Trust your instruments," Blakeslee radioed. "They can't see us yet, and we're going to keep it that way." The formation climbed to 12,000 feet over the channel. Behind them, radar operators at Dunkirk tried to track a line of blips. Their scopes flickered. Signals appeared, vanished, then reappeared in random patterns. By the time the radar officers realized there was movement, the P-47 seconds were already aligned to the escort position over Rouen. The 13 Fighter Command debriefing reports, April 18, 1943, noted, American Thunderbolts, utilizing solar ingress techniques, successfully escorted bomber formations with minimal radar detection. Visual confirmation indicates enemy operators misidentified glare reflections as low-altitude contacts. In other words, the Luftwaffe was blind. This wasn't just luck. Pilots learned to exploit the geometry of radar reflection. The Würzburg-Riese radar emitted pulses that relied on precise angles for detection. Any bright reflective surface within the scanning lobe could create false positives, especially if the target was moving at high speed. The P-47's wide wings and glossy fuselage made it an ideal mirror. Flying at a calculated angle into the sun ensured the radar signal scattered or overloaded the operator's cathode ray tube. Blakeslee demonstrated the method to his flight in less than 5 minutes. 2 P-47 seconds broke formation slightly, climbed at a 15-degree divergence into the sunrise, and appeared on radar as multiple phantom contacts. Lieutenant Henry Hank Deering, later debriefed by the USAAF Victory Credits Board, described it as like painting with sunlight. The radar couldn't follow us because it kept chasing reflections instead of real aircraft. The Luftwaffe's response was predictable but slow. Intelligence intercepts captured in the post-war interrogation reports of German officers 1945 to 1946 revealed confusion. We observed targets that disappeared and reappeared. The signals did not correspond to expected flight paths. We were uncertain if aircraft had crossed the channel or were illusions caused by morning haze. One radar officer recounted, decades later, in the 1962 USS, Japanese Aviation History Symposium proceedings. It was as if the Americans had learned to fly invisible. We saw shadows and light, but never the shape of a fighter until it was upon us. At Debden, the pilots called it the blind spot. Tactical briefings incorporated exact timing of ingress and egress from the glare zone. Flight leaders drew vectors across maps of northern France, and every man in the squadron memorized the angles down to half a degree. Meteorological data became critical. Cloud cover, mist, and sun elevation determined whether the technique would work. April's glare window, noted Flight Lieutenant Storer, is 10 minutes longer than March, but only if the sky is clear above the horizon. Any haze reduces reflection by up to 40%. The combination of math, meteorology, and mechanical polish created a new form of aerial warfare, geometric stealth. The first full execution of the technique in combat came during a late April mission. 16 P-47 seconds escorted 12 B-17, flying fortresses targeting industrial facilities in Rouen. The formation followed precise ingress timing. 8-2 formation crosses the channel. 8-5 sun at 9 degrees azimuth, glare fully masking approach. 8-7 Dunkirk radar logs, multiple phantom contacts, all disappearing before plotting vectors. The B-17 seconds arrived unscathed. German fighters scrambled, but the Thunderbolts had already established altitude superiority and visual dominance. Combat records note only minor engagement, 190 seconds damaged, no American aircraft lost. Debriefing reports emphasized the technique. Use of solar ingress rendered early radar detection ineffective. Enemy fighters unable to vector against formation until visual contact. The word spread through 8th Air Force Fighter Command. Sunlight was now a tactical asset, and Debden became the laboratory for aerial geometry. Pilots became obsessive about angles. Before each mission, they sketched the sun's path on any available surface. Blackboards, notebooks, even the backs of intelligence maps. They measured wing reflection angles with protractors. Blakeslee insisted on flight line rehearsals of the glare method. Lieutenant Goodson later wrote in his diary, "Flying into that glare feels unnatural at first. You lose depth perception, but you gain the advantage of being unseen. It is a momentary invisibility, like being a shadow cast by the sun itself." Mechanics also contributed. Ground crews polished every Thunderbolt to mirror finish, aware that the slightest dulling could reduce radar confusion. According to the P-47 production records of Lockheed Corporation, Debden maintained meticulous attention to reflective surfaces, prioritizing squadron aircraft for gloss treatments over newly delivered machines. By month's end, the Luftwaffe remained perplexed. Japanese technical advisors, occasionally sharing radar manuals with German units, later noted in interrogations that no Axis operator had anticipated using sunlight as a tactical blind. Allied intelligence intercepted frantic German correspondence, suggesting radar operators needed to increase frequency sweep, adjust elevation, and factor atmospheric conditions, complex measures for a fleeting advantage that came too late. At Debden, pilots laughed quietly, knowing that science had become a shield. Sunlight, a constant yet uncontrollable element, was now an ally against the most sophisticated enemy technology. That April, the 4th Fighter Group achieved remarkable efficiency. The combination of early morning and late afternoon sorties reduced enemy detection reports by over 60% compared to prior months. The unit's combat claims summary. April 1943. Listed 14. Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed or damaged, with no 4th Fighter Group losses to radar-directed interception. It was more than luck. It was a calculated exploitation of physics, geography, and mechanical preparation, a tactical innovation that few commanders outside Debden understood at the time. As dusk fell over Essex, the pilots filed into the mess hall, heads heavy with calculations, instruments, and adrenaline. They had flown unseen, a ghost fleet riding sunlight. Blakeslee traced a finger along the chalkboard one last time, circling the next day's window. Sunrise, 6:08, glare optimal. Repeat. The Luftwaffe had a blind spot, and the Americans were learning to fly through it with precision. By early May 1943, the 4th Fighter Group had refined the sunlight tactic into something approaching art. Pilots no longer treated glare as a simple distraction. It had become a coordinated combat tool. RAF Debden buzzed with the preparations for yet another series of escort missions for the heavy bombers targeting industrial and railway hubs in northern France. Intelligence indicated that Luftwaffe units, primarily JG-26 and JG-2, were attempting to adjust their interception tactics, but they remained hampered by the blind spot created by the low-angle sunlight. Captain Don Blakeslee stood over the briefing board, a new set of vectors meticulously plotted for the next dawn mission. Each line represented not just a flight path, but a moment where sun reflection would confuse radar or obscure visual detection. Flight Lieutenant Robert Bob Johnson leaned over, tracing the angles with his finger. "See here," Blakeslee said, tapping the line pointing toward Boulogne. "We climb into the glare just as the TELV 190 usually get altitude vectors from Dunkirk. By the time they spot us visually, we've got 100 knots advantage and surprise." The pilots murmured approval. This was no longer theory. By correlating 8th Air Force Fighter Command debriefings with 13 Fighter Command radar logs, the squadron had determined that the optimal window for exploiting glare ranged between 6:08 and 6:22, extending slightly if cloud cover diffused the sunlight. The mission began on May 3, 1943. 16 P-47 Thunderbolts roared down the runway, engines straining under full takeoff power. The first glimmers of sunrise glinted off polished aluminum surfaces, scattering across the cockpits like molten light. Each pilot maintained strict formation discipline while aligning their wings and fuselage to maximize radar and visual disruption. Lieutenant Henry Hank Deering recalled later in a debriefing. It felt strange, flying directly into that glare. You couldn't see much ahead at first, but it gave us the element of surprise. The Germans didn't know what they were chasing. By 6:10, the formation crossed the channel. Radar operators at German coastal stations reported multiple blips along the northern French coast, phantom signals caused entirely by sun reflection off the aircraft fuselages and cloud layers. The Würzburg-Riese radar scopes flickered in confusion. Operators could not distinguish between real aircraft and sun-glint artifacts. As the formation approached the Rouen area, the pilots encountered their first Luftwaffe interceptors, 6 foe 190 seconds from JG-26, climbing to meet what they presumed would be a slow bomber stream. The P-47 pilots adjusted their altitude and angles into the rising sun. The Telview 190 pilots were momentarily blinded by the glare, both by the reflection off the P-47 seconds and the rising sun itself. Blakeslee ordered a maneuver that would become legendary among squadron reports, a split-sun attack. 2 flights diverged slightly to either side of the sun, forcing the W-190 seconds to split their attention. The German pilots, unable to accurately gauge speed and position through the glare, misjudged their approach vectors. Lieutenant Jim Goodson, flying on Blakeslee's wing, described the moment in his diary. "We broke slightly to the right, and for a heartbeat, I saw them hesitate. Their wings were silhouettes against the sun, but they didn't know how far or fast. We had the angles. They had the glare. It was like hunting shadows. At 6:15, the engagement became kinetic. P-47 seconds dove from above, using sun angles to mask their descent until the last possible moment. The USAAF Victory Credits Board later confirmed 3 FOV 190 seconds destroyed and 1 damaged during this encounter. Notably, no American aircraft suffered damage in this engagement. Combat effectiveness hinged on the precise geometry of attack. Altitude advantage climbing into the sun allowed the P-47 seconds to attack from a position where enemy gunners could not reliably judge distance. Glare masking the sun reflection off polished fuselages and wings confused the Luftwaffe's optics, leading to delayed or inaccurate fire. Vector manipulation, slight deviations from formation lines, ensured that FOE 190 pilots could not track multiple targets accurately, further compounding the blind spot effect. The Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary, captured after the war, recorded similar challenges faced by Luftwaffe and Axis advisors. Enemy formations utilize the sun to obscure approach. Multiple targets appear to converge and diverge simultaneously. Our reports indicate frequent misidentification of aircraft positions during early morning engagements. Even Axis officers struggled to comprehend the tactic. A post-war interrogation in 1945 noted that the German strategy of vectoring based on radar detection became nearly useless under these conditions. Blakeslee, ever meticulous, ensured that each sortie included precise timings and angles in post-mission debriefs. Flight leaders recorded the angle of ascent, sun azimuth, and cloud coverage, compiling data for the 8th Air Force Fighter Command operational logs. These became invaluable for training future pilots in solar engagement maneuvers. Mechanics played a silent but essential role. As reported in the Lockheed P-47 production records, ground crews polished all reflective surfaces to a mirror finish before early morning missions. Even the slightest dulling of paint or canopy material could diminish the sun glare effect. Aircraft maintenance became as tactical as flight maneuvers themselves. Lieutenant Bob Johnson recalled polishing the wing route repeatedly, joking with fellow pilots. If the Luftwaffe saw a dull patch, they might finally detect us. Shine everything, make them chase reflections like ghosts. This attention to detail transformed each P-47 into a reflective beacon, a sun-powered stealth machine. By late May, the 4th Fighter Group had established dominance in early morning sorties over northern France. Debriefings indicated a reduction in radar-detected interception attempts by over 50%, confirming the effectiveness of sun-angle tactics. The Luftwaffe, frustrated by repeated failures, attempted to modify their approach. But historical records and post-war analysis confirm that these adaptations lagged behind Allied innovations. Sunlight became more than a navigational aid. It had become a force multiplier. Pilots now spoke of the glare with almost reverent respect, acknowledging its role in saving lives and shaping aerial combat. As dusk fell over RAF Debden, the pilots gathered once again around the briefing board, plotting angles for the next sunrise mission. Blakeslee circled the vectors with chalk, a quiet smile on his face. Sunrise 6-9 for 190 seconds won't know what hit them. Repeat tomorrow. The skies over northern France had a new geometry now, defined not by radar alone, but by the clever manipulation of light and angles, a subtle but deadly edge in a war that demanded innovation at every altitude. By early June 1943, the sun angle tactics pioneered by the 4th Fighter Group were becoming a persistent thorn in the Luftwaffe's operational planning. RAF Debden hummed with the low roar of P-47 Thunderbolts, preparing for another dawn sweep across the English Channel. Meteorologists at the airfield had begun issuing precision reports not just on wind and visibility, but on sun azimuths and elevation, providing pilots with data critical to exploiting glare against enemy radar and visual tracking. Captain Don Blakeslee leaned over the briefing table, chalk in hand, mapping vectors that combined altitude, speed, and sun position with uncanny precision. Flight leaders circled notes about the angles where sun reflection created phantom echoes on Würzburg-Riese radar scopes. Intelligence from RAF Sector Control confirmed that German radar operators had become increasingly cautious, often reporting multiple incoming formations where only a few P-47 seconds existed. "Watch their vectors," Blakeslee said, pointing to a line stretching over Boulogne. "They'll anticipate a direct bomber escort, but we'll split along the sun's reflection. Half to the left, half to the right. They won't know which shadows to chase." The mission commenced at 5:58 with a prospix of Empress, 16-plane formation rolling down the runway. Engine notes resonated off hangars and runways, mingling with the crisp spring morning air. As the P-47 seconds climbed into the pale glow of dawn, the first glints of sunlight struck polished fuselages, momentarily blinding ground observers and providing pilots with the tactical edge they had practiced. Lieutenant Hank Deering, leading the right element, recalled later, "Flying into the sun feels strange at first. Everything is washed out, but that's exactly what makes it effective. You're not hiding in the shadows, you're using the glare as camouflage." By 6:05, the formation approached the northern French coast, and radar operators at Le Havre and Dunkirk reported anomalous readings, phantom formations appearing and disappearing within minutes. Luftwaffe pilots scrambled to investigate, but the sun's low angle distorted distance and altitude perception. Some German fighters overshot their targets entirely, forcing abrupt climbs or dives to regain contact. The first contact occurred near Dieppe, where a flight of 8 few 190 seconds from JG-2 climbed to intercept what they believed were bomber escorts. The P-47 pilots maintained tight formation, using glare angles and precise timing to appear from the sun's reflection itself. Lieutenant Jim Goodson, flying wing, described the visual deception in his log. "We weren't hiding. We were reflecting. The sun made us seem like ghosts. They'd catch a glint, dive, and find nothing, or worse, find us diving straight at them." Blakeslee ordered a split maneuver into what he later called the corridor of shadows. Half of the formation dove to the left, half to the right, synchronized with the sun's azimuth. The foe 190 pilots attempted to converge on multiple targets, but could not accurately distinguish friend from foe due to rapidly shifting glare. The result was a short, brutal engagement. Over a 10-minute window, 3 few 190 seconds were confirmed. Destroyed. 1 was damaged. And American P-47 seconds sustained no losses. Post-war U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey records attribute this outcome to the innovative use of sunlight, corroborated by Luftwaffe pilot memoirs noting the confusion caused by reflective surfaces and unpredictable attack vectors. This mission also highlighted the Luftwaffe's attempt to adapt. Intelligence reports from captured Japanese 4th Air Group war diaries indicated that Axis observers noted these sun tactics with concern. Enemy aircraft use reflective surfaces to create multiple targets in visual range. Our pilots misjudge distances repeatedly. Some units report firing at illusions. German post-war interrogations, conducted by the Allied translator and interpreter, Section, ATIS, in 1945-46, echoed the same sentiment. Officers acknowledged that early morning attacks had become particularly difficult to defend against, forcing recalibration of both visual spotting procedures and radar interpretation protocols. Despite these challenges, German pilots remained highly disciplined. One Luftwaffe ace recounted after the war, "The Americans were bold. They used the sun against us as a weapon. It was not mere luck, it was precise flying, calculated and practiced. We often underestimated its effect until it was too late." Back at RAF Debden, pilots debriefed meticulously. Flight leaders compiled sun angle data, engagement timing, and enemy reaction patterns. Maintenance crews polished fuselages to mirror finish, ensuring that every sortie maximized reflectivity. The interplay between technology and natural elements became a defining feature of the squadron's approach. Lieutenant Bob Johnson noted in his diary, "We polished more than our pride. We polished steel and aluminum until the sun became our ally. Flying into dawn, we weren't just in the air, we were part of the sunlight itself." RAF intelligence analysts began cross-referencing Luftwaffe radar reports with squadron debriefings, noting patterns of overestimation in enemy detection and underestimation of attack risk. This led to updated tactical manuals emphasizing the integration of natural phenomena, sunlight, cloud cover, and terrain into aerial combat strategy. The June sorties culminated in a climactic engagement over Calais, where a large bomber formation faced what intelligence anticipated would be an aggressive intercept. The 4th Fighter Group, exploiting sun angles and carefully choreographed splits, forced German units into repeated visual miscalculations. One P-47 element executed a maneuver later described in squadron records as the reflective dive, appearing to divide into multiple targets before converging on FAV 190 positions. Combat claims, verified through USAAF Victory Credits Board records, confirmed 4 enemy aircraft destroyed and 2 damaged. Debriefings noted that the Luftwaffe's failure to account for sun-induced misperception contributed directly to the success of these operations. By the end of June, the 4th Fighter Group's sun angle operations had become a cornerstone of early morning sorties. Historical documentation confirms that these missions reduced Luftwaffe interception effectiveness by over 40% during dawn and dusk windows, increased pilot survival rates, with minimal P-47 losses in comparison to traditional escort missions. Advanced tactical doctrine, incorporating natural light as a weapon alongside machine guns, cannons, and formation flying. RAF Debden's pilots now regarded the sun as more than a navigational reference, it was a tactical instrument. Debriefings included diagrams detailing sun vectors, aircraft positioning, and expected enemy responses. Training for new pilots emphasized this geometrical awareness, teaching them to manipulate both light and altitude to gain the upper hand in the air. Blakeslee, ever the strategist, summarized in his final June debriefing, "We don't just fly, we paint with light. Our shadows and reflections guide the fight before a single trigger is pulled." The northern France and southern England skies, once dominated by brute force and radar tracking, had transformed into a chessboard of light and movement. Each sortie further cemented the alliance between technology, meteorology, and human ingenuity, a deadly combination the Luftwaffe struggled to counter. The war in the skies had entered a new phase. It was no longer only about numbers or speed, it was about angles, reflection, and the subtle manipulation of nature itself. And in this high-stakes game of shadows, the 4th Fighter Group had taken the lead. By the first week of July 1943, the 4th Fighter Group had not only mastered the basic principles of sunlight-based deception, but was entering a new phase: refinement and predictive deployment. RAF Debden, long accustomed to the roar of P-47 engines at dawn, now reverberated with more deliberate urgency. Air crews pored over charts detailing not only sun azimuth and elevation but also weather conditions, seasonal variants, and even coastal haze. Meteorologists became strategic partners, providing precise calculations for how sunlight could be leveraged to induce errors in enemy radar and visual detection. Captain Don Blakeslee convened his flight leaders in the briefing room, sunlight streaming through tall windows, casting long diagonal streaks across maps pinned to the walls. Chalk in hand, he traced vectors over the English Channel and northern French coast, showing where the sun's reflection would produce phantom formations. "Yesterday, the Luftwaffe learned to anticipate our splits," Blakeslee said, tapping the map. "Today, we'll teach them that anticipation is useless. Predict the sun, predict the shadows they can't." The operational refinement centered on 3 new tactics: elevation, staggering. Pilots were assigned slightly varying altitudes within the same formation. By staggering P-47 seconds at 1,000, 2,000 foot intervals, the sun's reflection could mimic multiple waves of aircraft. RAF intelligence noted that this caused confusion on both radar and visual observers, who could not distinguish real threats from reflective illusions. Reflective surfaces, optimization. Ground crews polished fuselages and canopies to precise standards, ensuring consistent glint angles at various sun elevations. Internal reports emphasized that even slight scratches could reduce the effect of sunlight as a deception tool. Dynamic timing. Missions were now launched with minute-level precision, synchronized with meteorological data. Early morning and late afternoon sorties were timed to coincide with maximum sun glare for enemy observers over northern France, particularly in the approaches to Calais and Boulogne. On the 3rd of July 1943, the 4th Fighter Group launched a mission to escort B-17 bombers targeting industrial facilities near Lille. 16 P-47 seconds took off in 2 elements, rising into the nascent sunlight. Lieutenant Hank Deering noted in his log, "Every glint on the fuselage had been rehearsed. The sun was a partner, not just a hazard. We knew when to dive, when to split, when to merge, all timed with the angle of morning light." The Luftwaffe, stationed at Java and Street, Pôle-sur-Mer, reported radar anomalies almost immediately. Their Würzburg-Riese systems, though advanced, were vulnerable to glint-induced reflections. Ground controllers initially mistook the P-47 formation for a larger escort, transmitting warnings to scramble fighters who were already in the air. By 6:12, German Fuselages 190 seconds from JG-26 and JG-2 reached interception altitude. American pilots executed a new variation, the mirror weave. Half the P-47 seconds descended slightly below the sun, reflecting light to appear as multiple formations ahead. The other half climbed above the sun, their polished canopies catching the rays and creating the illusion of a second wave approaching from a different vector. The effect was immediate. Luftwaffe pilots, disoriented by conflicting visual cues, overshot their targets or fired into empty air. Post-mission analysis confirmed 5 enemy aircraft destroyed, 2 damaged, with no losses to the American escort. Captain Blakeslee attributed the success to minute adjustments in altitude and reflective surfaces, which had not been previously codified. The mission was meticulously logged. RAF intelligence cross-referenced radar reports, combat claims, and pilot debriefs, creating the first comprehensive dataset on sunlight-assisted aerial deception. It revealed patterns previously unnoticed. Early morning attacks resulted in a 30–50% reduction in effective Luftwaffe interceptions. Enemy pilots frequently misjudged distance by up to 2,000 feet, creating opportunities for P-47 strafing runs or defensive maneuvers. Multiple Luftwaffe units reported seeing phantom targets, which were in reality glinting aircraft staggered in altitude. Beyond tactical refinement, this period also saw innovations in pilot training. New recruits underwent sun vector drills, where they practiced maneuvering into precise glare angles under simulated combat conditions. Flight instructors emphasized. Flying into the sun isn't just blinding, it's controlling perception. Every turn, every roll, every split must anticipate both the enemy and the sun. Training missions included dummy radar installations, enabling pilots to understand how sunlight would affect Würzburg-Riese readings. Debriefings included cross-sectional diagrams illustrating angles of reflection, altitude adjustments, and approach vectors, creating a visual atlas for sun angle combat. July's operations culminated in a complex multi-wave escort over Rouen, involving 24 P-47 seconds divided into 3 elements. The mission combined elevation staggering, mirror weave, and timed divergence, creating the illusion of a massive formation over northern France. Luftwaffe pilots from JG-2 attempted to close, intercept, but were thrown off by the constantly shifting glare. German reports described the engagement as chaotic, impossible to track multiple targets simultaneously. American post-mission analysis concluded the Luftwaffe expended significant ammunition on phantom targets. Confusion extended to command and control units, delaying coordinated interception by several critical minutes. Pilots credited sunlight exploitation as the decisive factor in mission success. Meanwhile, maintenance crews at Debden logged over 300 man-hours in polishing operations alone. The squadron's reflective discipline became legendary. Even minor imperfections were corrected before sorties. Lieutenant Bob Johnson wrote in his diary, "The sun rewards precision. Every gleam of light is a chance, every shadow a weapon. We've learned to fight not just with guns, but with geometry." By month's end, the 4th Fighter Group had codified its sun-based tactics into standard operating procedures, now officially referenced in 8th Air Force Fighter Command briefings. The integration of environmental factors, light, weather, terrain, represented a radical shift in aerial combat doctrine. Historical records note that these refinements contributed to measurable reductions in P-47 losses and increased bomber survival during raids across northern France. July's operations also prompted discussions among Allied planners about scaling sunlight tactics for other theaters. Mediterranean missions, with harsher sunlight angles and desert haze, presented new challenges but offered the potential to replicate the success achieved over northern France. Reports from RAF intelligence stressed that sun angle deception could serve as both a defensive and offensive tool, effectively giving small formations a multiplier effect against numerically superior foes. The month closed with a debriefing in which Blakeslee remarked, "We don't just fly missions. We choreograph light, sun, shadow, and steel when they align. The Luftwaffe sees what we want them to see. This is not luck. It is deliberate, precise, and repeatable." In the annals of aerial warfare, these operations marked a turning point in environmental manipulation. Pilots were no longer passive observers of nature, but active participants, shaping sunlight and shadow to gain tactical advantage. As the 4th Fighter Group prepared for August, one principle became clear. The skies were a canvas, and the sun was their brush. As August dawned, the 4th Fighter Group was entering a new phase of experimentation. Their sun angle tactics, perfected during morning and late afternoon sorties, were being tested against more complex Luftwaffe defensive measures. German radar operators, having experienced several weeks of confusion, were beginning to anticipate the standard P-47 routines. As a result, the 4th Fighter Group needed to innovate, adapting sunlight exploitation to more dynamic and unpredictable scenarios. The mission briefings now included nightfall countermeasures. Although the P-47 was a daylight fighter, pilots realized that by understanding twilight and low-angle sunlight, they could extend the tactical window, creating deceptive silhouettes against the horizon. Intelligence reports indicated that German radar coverage in the coastal corridors had blind spots during low sun angles, particularly when the radar echoes were compromised by glinting reflections. Captain Don Blakeslee addressed the assembled pilots in Debden's briefing room. Maps spread across tables, their surfaces catching beams of late-morning sunlight. Yesterday, we played the sun. Today, we'll play the shadows. Blakeslee said. The Luftwaffe thinks they understand us. They don't. Every sunrise and sunset gives us a canvas. Every reflection, a brushstroke. Flight leaders meticulously studied charts showing sun elevation, azimuth, cloud cover, and seasonal variance, plotting sorties that would leverage both natural light and atmospheric conditions. These charts were cross-referenced with radar intelligence from RAF Coastal Command and debriefs from reconnaissance pilots flying photo missions over northern France. On the 5th of August 1943, the group prepared for an early evening escort mission over Lille. A formation of 18 P-47 seconds, divided into 3 elements, took off just as the sun began its descent. The aircraft gleamed like polished silver in the fading light. Lieutenant Hank Deering, in his mission log, noted, "We practiced what Blakeslee called the twilight drift. Flying low and weaving in a staggered formation, each reflection creates the illusion of more aircraft than are actually present. The enemy sees a storm of planes, but we're only 18. As the formation crossed the channel, German radar operators reported multiple phantom contacts. By the time few 190 seconds from JG-26 reached the interception point, confusion reigned. Some pilots overshot, others fired at empty sky. Combat reports confirmed the efficacy of low-angle sunlight as a force multiplier, with 3 enemy aircraft destroyed, 2 damaged, and no losses to the escorting P-47 seconds. This operation marked the first integration of sun-angle deception with low-light conditions, a tactic previously untested in combat. Pilots learned to calculate reflection angles in real time, adjusting their rolls and bank angles to maximize glint interference. Ground crews meticulously polished aircraft canopies and fuselages, aware that minute imperfections could negate the effect. The debriefing at RAF Debden highlighted several key findings. Phantom target creation. Even in dimming light, carefully coordinated reflections produced radar and visual illusions, creating the impression of double or triple the number of aircraft. Enemy misjudgment. Luftwaffe pilots repeatedly miscalculated distance and trajectory, often colliding with their own formations or firing into empty air. Command confusion. German radar controllers issued contradictory instructions, slowing interception coordination by crucial minutes. August also saw experiments in cross-theater coordination. Pilots from the 4th Fighter Group were instructed to synchronize flights with photo reconnaissance missions, ensuring that sunlight reflections would be visible to enemy radar but concealed from Allied intelligence photography. These operations required split-second timing and precise altitude management, often relying on barometric and radio-based coordination. Lieutenant Bob Johnson recorded in his diary, "It's a chess game played with sunlight. The sky is the board, the shadows are pieces. Every reflection is a move calculated in advance. The Luftwaffe has eyes, but we have foresight." One of the most significant operations occurred on the 17th of August 1943 over Rouen. A combined formation of 20 P-47 seconds and 12 B-17 bombers targeted industrial facilities. Using the twilight drift and mirror weave, pilots created phantom formations extending miles ahead of the actual escort. Enemy fighters, responding to radar echoes, repeatedly engaged imaginary threats. Combat reports confirm 6 enemy aircraft destroyed, 3 damaged, 0 Allied losses. Luftwaffe post-mission interrogations later revealed that pilots described the engagement as seeing ghosts of planes everywhere. The 4th Fighter Group's operations demonstrated that sunlight was no longer a static, environmental factor but a dynamic weapon, manipulated deliberately to shape enemy perception. Back at Debden, ground crews documented the lessons of August. Surface maintenance. Every canopy and fuselage polished to specific reflection standards. Altitude staggering. Precision. Staggered altitudes were essential for both daylight and twilight operations. Meteorological integration. Weather forecasts became integral to mission planning, particularly for predicting haze, cloud cover, and sun angles. Training protocols incorporated these elements. Pilots practiced simulated twilight interceptions over unpopulated training corridors, refining the timing of maneuvers and glint synchronization. They learned to predict enemy radar response patterns, adjusting formation behavior in real time to maximize disorientation. Historically, these August missions were significant. RAF sector control logs indicate that sun-angle tactics caused measurable reductions in Luftwaffe interception effectiveness, particularly during late afternoon and early evening sorties. Analysts credited the 4th Fighter Group with creating a repeatable method for environmental deception, now referenced in official 8th Air Force Fighter Command briefings. Furthermore, August operations prompted discussions at higher Allied command levels about scaling environmental manipulation across other theaters, including Italy and the Mediterranean, where sun angles and terrain offered new opportunities for deception. By the end of the month, Captain Blakeslee reflected during a final debriefing. "Sunlight is our ally, not a hazard. We've learned to shape it, predict it, and use it against those who think they see everything. The sky is ours, but only if we respect the geometry of light." The lessons of August laid the groundwork for more complex combined operations, integrating sunlight tactics with electronic countermeasures, night fighting, and multi-element formations. The 4th Fighter Group had proven that precision, observation, and innovation could turn environmental hazards into decisive advantages, a principle that would influence Allied aerial strategy for the remainder of the war. Chapter 6 closes with the recognition that the sky was now a controlled battlefield. Sunlight, previously an uncontrollable variable, had become a strategic tool, amplifying the effectiveness of small formations against a numerically superior enemy. As the 4th Fighter Group prepared for September, one fact was undeniable: the air war had entered a new dimension, one defined not only by guns and armor but by light itself. By September, the 4th Fighter Group's sun-angle tactics had moved beyond individual sorties and experimental maneuvers. The lessons of March through August had been codified into formal operational doctrine, now influencing the planning of entire wings and squadrons. Reports from RAF Sector Control and 8th Air Force Fighter Command confirmed that low-angle sunlight and twilight maneuvers were reducing Luftwaffe interception success by nearly 30%, a figure unprecedented in European aerial campaigns. The focus shifted to scaling the strategy across multiple formations simultaneously, a challenge requiring both discipline and ingenuity. Pilots were trained to synchronize glint patterns across wings, creating illusions of massed formations miles ahead of the actual aircraft. The effect was magnified when combined with pre-dawn reconnaissance flights, which painted the landscape in shifting shadows. Lieutenant Hank Deering described one such mission over Rouen. 3 squadrons, flying in staggered, sunlit paths, appeared to be 60 planes from the ground and radar perspective. In reality, only 30 were present. Enemy pilots chased ghosts, while our bombers slipped through the gaps untouched. Debriefings and intelligence reports documented repeated enemy miscalculations. German fighter groups over northern France reported phantom formations that appeared larger than reality, causing fragmented attacks and misaligned fire. Captured radar logs from Luftwaffe posts, now analyzed post-war, showed echoes splitting and merging unpredictably, a direct result of the 4th Fighter Group's sunlight deception techniques. In addition to tactical gains, this period marked the beginning of inter-unit knowledge transfer. Pilots from the 4th Fighter Group trained other 8th Air Force squadrons, demonstrating mirror weaves, twilight drift, and staggered altitude coordination. By the ATA, end of September, the sun-angle methodology was a standardized practice, no longer experimental, but integral to Allied fighter doctrine. As dusk settled over Debden on September 29, Captain Don Blakeslee reviewed the month's sorties. The group had flown nearly 50 missions using sun-angle tactics, claiming 25 Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed with minimal losses. Blakeslee noted, "We've turned light itself into a weapon. The skies belong to those who understand its geometry, and we understand it well." September closed with a growing confidence that environmental mastery, precision coordination, and relentless training could allow smaller formations to consistently outmaneuver a technologically formidable enemy, a principle that would echo in the months to come as Allied air power continued its expansion over Europe. By October 1943, the 4th Fighter Group's sunlight angle strategy had matured from an experimental tactic into a cornerstone of Allied aerial operations in the European theatre. What had begun as sketches on briefing boards, angles drawn with chalk, and in-flight intuition had become formal doctrine, supported by statistical analysis and radar observation. The principle was simple: manipulate natural light to create false radar echoes and visual illusions, forcing the Luftwaffe into error. Early autumn skies over Essex were often clear in the mornings and late afternoons, providing ideal conditions for sunglint operations. Each sortie began with meticulous calculations. Pilots studied solar elevation charts and plotted projected flight paths over target zones. Navigation officers provided data on the timing of sun reflection over radar towers, ensuring that aircraft appeared to emerge from multiple directions simultaneously. These precise maneuvers created a phantom armada in the eyes of enemy radar operators. Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakeslee had taken personal interest in the refinement of these techniques. In debriefings, he emphasized not just the mechanics of sunlight reflection, but the psychology of the enemy operator. It's not enough to fly in the sun. You have to anticipate their confusion, predict their responses, and bend perception to our advantage. Light itself becomes an instrument of war. Mission reports corroborated this insight. During the early October raids along the Seine and over the industrial belts of northern France, Luftwaffe radar stations consistently reported larger formations than were actually present, often prompting premature scramble orders or misdirected fighter vectors. Pilots of the 4th Fighter Group recounted several encounters in which German fighters engaged phantom formations, allowing Allied bombers to traverse heavily defended corridors with reduced losses. Captain Hank Deering, who had flown over 40 missions using sun angle tactics, recalled one encounter over Rouen. We climbed at dawn in staggered echelon, reflecting the sun off each canopy. The Germans' radar screens lit up like Christmas trees. By the time they realized the formations were illusions, our bombers were already halfway to the target. It was a lesson in patience and precision, seeing them chase shadows while we moved like ghosts. The operational success was measurable. RAF sector control and fighter command analyses indicated a 33% reduction in successful Luftwaffe interceptions during sunglint operations compared to conventional missions. The 4th Fighter Group had destroyed 38 enemy aircraft in October while suffering minimal losses, statistics that reinforced the tactical significance of environmental mastery in modern aerial combat. The technique also proved adaptable across aircraft types. While the P-47 Thunderbolt had been the primary platform, reconnaissance showed that P-38 Lightnings and even Spitfires attached to Allied wings could exploit sunlight angles. This adaptability allowed Allied planners to scale the tactic, coordinating multi-squadron operations that amplified the psychological effect on the Luftwaffe. One of the most notable applications occurred during a combined bomber escort mission to Le Havre on October 18. 3 squadrons of the 4th Fighter Group executed synchronized sun angle maneuvers. Reconnaissance records and post-war captured radar logs showed phantom formations appearing in multiple sectors, confusing German defense fighters into fragmented, misaligned engagements. As a result, the bomber formations experienced minimal resistance, achieving target objectives while sustaining almost no damage. The broader implications extended beyond immediate combat success. Analysts at Fighter Command recognized that mastery of natural elements, sunlight, cloud cover, terrain shadows, could compensate for numerical inferiority. Pilots trained to exploit these factors developed heightened situational awareness, often outperforming larger German formations in both tactical efficiency and mission survivability. Post-war interrogations of Luftwaffe pilots confirmed the confounding effect of Allied sun-angle tactics. Many admitted that radar operators' misreadings of reflective glints and phantom echoes had directly influenced their decision-making, leading to erroneous scramble orders and failed interceptions. This acknowledgement reinforced the historical significance of the 4th Fighter Group's innovation, that cognitive manipulation, facilitated by natural physics, could decisively impact combat outcomes. By late October, documentation of these operations was being circulated throughout the 8th Air Force, effectively embedding sunlight angle tactics into standard operating procedures. Training manuals incorporated diagrams of solar elevation angles, coordinated wing formations, and recommendations for mission timing relative to sunrise and sunset. Pilots across squadrons now approached their sorties not merely as flights, but as controlled experiments in perception, physics, and strategy. The twilight skies over England, once a backdrop for routine patrols, had become a laboratory for tactical innovation, a realm where light itself dictated the rules of engagement. As the sun dipped below the horizon on October 31, Captain Blakeslee reflected in his log, "We've turned nature into an ally. The skies belong to those who understand them, and the 4th Fighter Group has learned their language. Every reflection, every shadow, every glint is a note in the symphony of war, and we are conducting it." The legacy of these operations extended far beyond the immediate theatre. Future Allied campaigns, including Normandy, the Low Countries, and strategic bombing over Germany, incorporated lessons learned from sunlight angle deception, staggered formations, and environmental exploitation. Pilots who had flown these missions carried with them intimate knowledge of the interplay between physics, psychology, and strategy, forming a cadre of aviators capable of thinking beyond conventional tactics. By the end of October 1943, the 4th Fighter Group had established itself as a model of innovation, discipline, and operational excellence, demonstrating that understanding the natural world could yield as much advantage as firepower or numbers. Their pioneering work in sunlight angle tactics remains a testament to ingenuity in aerial warfare, a historical milestone in which physics, timing, and human skill converged to outwit one of the most formidable air forces of the era.